Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who had performed for presidents and thousands of screaming fans, was sobbing uncontrollably in a small-town diner at 2 a.m. All because a 40-year-old waitress named Betty had said 6 simple words to him. "You look like you need a hug, honey." What happened next would remind Elvis what unconditional love really felt like, and show him that sometimes the most powerful performances happen not on stage, but in the quiet moments when someone treats you exactly like what you need most. Family. But let me take you back to how we got to that moment, because the story of what led Elvis to break down in Betty's arms is something every person who's ever felt lost and alone needs to hear. It was November 23rd, 1974, and Elvis was driving through small-town Arkansas at 2 a.m. after what might have been the worst recording session of his career in Nashville. Nothing had gone right that day. The songs weren't working, his voice felt strained, and the pressure from Colonel Parker, the record label, and everyone whose livelihood depended on him felt suffocating. He'd been driving for hours, taking back roads through Tennessee into Arkansas, trying to outrun the feeling that he was losing the one thing that had always made him feel alive. When exhaustion and hunger forced him to pull into Martha's all-night diner, Elvis sat in his car staring at the flickering neon sign. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, except for one waitress and a trucker, more interested in his coffee than conversation. The waitress was cleaning tables with methodical care, someone who had been doing this work for years and still took pride in it. Her name was Betty Morrison, and she was exactly the kind of person who made small-town diners feel like home. 40 years old, mother of 3 teenage kids, possessed of warm, no-nonsense wisdom that comes from years of taking care of everyone around you. She had learned to read people during her 12 years serving coffee to strangers, could spot heartbreak from across the room, and knew exactly what people needed to hear. Elvis slid into a corner booth, baseball cap pulled low, hoping to eat quietly and get back on the road. Betty approached with a coffee pot and a genuine smile. "Coffee, honey?" she asked, already pouring. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." "You look tired, sweetie. Long drive?" Her voice carried the musical cadence of Arkansas, soft and welcoming. Elvis nodded, not trusting his voice. Something about her maternal tone was already getting to him. "Well, you just sit there and relax. I'll get you something good to eat." She paused, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years reading people. "What sounds appealing?" "Whatever you recommend," Elvis said quietly. When Betty brought his food, meatloaf with brown gravy, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread that smelled homemade, she surprised him by sliding into the booth across from him. "You mind if I take a quick break? My feet are killing me," she said with a tired laugh. "I'm Betty Morrison," she said, extending her hand, "and you look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." When Elvis shook her hand, he was surprised by the calluses, the strength. These were hands that had worked hard for everything. "I'm Elvis," he said, deciding on honesty. Betty's eyebrows raised slightly. "Elvis Presley, I presume?" When he nodded, she smiled. "Well, right now you just look like a man who's had a really rough day and needs someone to listen." The simple acceptance in her voice was so unexpected that Elvis felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "Just one of those days," he managed to say, cutting into the meatloaf to avoid meeting her eyes. "Honey, I've raised 3 teenagers and worked in this diner for 12 years. I've served coffee to heartbroken truck drivers, divorced businessmen, and more lonely souls than I can count. I know the difference between one of those days and one of those lives. Which one are we dealing with here?" Elvis looked up at her, and for the first time since entering the diner, really made eye contact. Betty had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen plenty of heartache, but hadn't let it make her bitter. "Sometimes," Elvis said slowly, "I feel like I'm drowning and everyone around me is just watching it happen." Betty nodded knowingly. "Fame's a lonely business, isn't it? You know who I am? Honey, I've got 3 kids. Of course I know who you are. But right now, you're just someone who needs a good meal and someone to listen. And that's when Elvis began to tell Betty Morrison everything. About the pressure of constantly performing, about feeling like he'd lost touch with who he really was, about missing his mother every single day and feeling like he was failing everyone who depended on him. "Sometimes I feel like I'm performing my whole life, not just when I'm working," Elvis said. "Like I've forgotten how to just be a regular person." Betty listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions, sometimes just nodding with understanding. "You know what I think?" Betty said when Elvis finished talking. "I think you've forgotten that it's okay to be human. You've been taking care of everyone else for so long that you've forgotten someone needs to take care of you too." There was something about Betty's warm acceptance that made Elvis feel safe in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "I know the feeling," Elvis said quietly, "about feeling lost. Sometimes I look in the mirror and don't recognize who's staring back. Everyone sees Elvis Presley, but I don't know who that is anymore." Betty leaned forward, giving him her full attention. "When did you last feel like yourself?" Elvis thought about that longer than expected. "Maybe when I was recording at Sun Studio back in 54, 55, when it was just about the music, before it became about image and money and keeping everyone else happy. What was different then? I wasn't trying to be anything other than what I was. My mama was still alive then. She'd listen to me practice and tell me I was good, not because I was famous, but because the music made her feel something. You miss her." "Every single day." Elvis's voice broke. "She died in 1958, and part of me died with her. She was the only person who loved me before I was anything." For the next 20 minutes, Elvis talked about Gladys Presley, about her laugh, the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd stay up all night when he was sick as a child. "She used to tell me that music was God's gift, and I had a responsibility to use it to make people feel less alone," Elvis said. "But lately, I feel like I'm making people feel more alone, including myself." Betty reached across and covered Elvis's hand with her own. "Elvis, when's the last time someone filled your cup instead of drinking from it?" Elvis stared at her, and suddenly he couldn't hold back the tears that had been building all day, all week, all year. They came in waves: grief for his mother, exhaustion from performing, loneliness from being surrounded by people who needed things from him. Betty moved to his side of the booth and put her arm around his shoulders, letting him cry against her shoulder. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "You don't have to be strong for me. You can just be you." That's when she said it, those 6 words that would change everything. Betty looked at Elvis's tear-stained face and saw past the famous features to the frightened, lonely man underneath. "You look like you need a hug, honey." And Elvis Presley, the man who had been hugged by thousands of fans, who had embraced presidents and movie stars, who had been surrounded by people his entire adult life, completely fell apart. He started crying harder than he had since his mother's funeral. Not the dignified tears of a performer moved by his own music, but the deep, desperate sobs of someone who had been holding everything together for too long and finally had permission to let go. Betty didn't hesitate for even a moment. She wrapped her arms around Elvis and held him while he cried, one hand stroking his hair the way his mother used to do, whispering the kinds of things mothers say to their children when the world feels too big and too scary. "It's okay, baby. You just let it all out. You don't have to be strong for me. You don't have to perform for me. You don't have to be anything but exactly who you are right now." Elvis cried for 15 minutes straight while Betty held him, and she never once seemed uncomfortable or impatient. She didn't try to shush him or tell him everything would be okay. She just held him like he was one of her own children coming home after a particularly difficult day, needing nothing more than unconditional love and acceptance. The trucker at the counter glanced over once, but Betty caught his eye and gave him a look that said, "Mind your own business," and he returned to his coffee and late-night snack without another word. This was sacred space now, a place where someone was being healed through the simple act of being held. When Elvis finally began to compose himself, his breathing slowing and the sobs turning into occasional shudders, Betty handed him a stack of napkins from the dispenser. "Better?" she asked quietly. Elvis wiped his eyes and looked at her with something approaching wonder. "I haven't cried like that since my mother died." Sometimes we need to, Betty said simply. Crying isn't weak. It's just your heart washing itself clean so it can feel things properly again. If this story is touching your heart the way it's touching mine, please hit that subscribe button. Betty's act of pure maternal love is something we all need to hear about, and there are more incredible stories of human kindness like this one coming. When Elvis finally composed himself, he pulled back and looked at Betty with red eyes and a grateful heart. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over me." "Don't you dare apologize for being human," Betty said firmly. "You think you're the first person who's cried in my arms? Honey, I've got 3 kids, and before that I had a husband who came back from Vietnam broken in ways I couldn't fix. Sometimes people need to fall apart so they can remember how to put themselves back together." Elvis wiped his eyes with the napkin Betty handed him. "How do you do it? How do you take care of everyone and still have so much love left to give?" Betty smiled. "Because taking care of people isn't something that runs out when you use it. The more love you give, the more you have. That's the secret my mama taught me, and that's what I'm teaching my kids." Elvis spent another hour in that diner, talking to Betty about his daughter Lisa Marie, his hopes and fears about being a father. Betty shared stories of her 3 children, David Jr. starting college, Sarah with dreams of teaching, Michael making everyone laugh with his natural humor. "They're good kids with big dreams," Betty said, showing him their school photos. "Sometimes I worry I'm not doing enough to help them reach those dreams." Elvis listened to her talk about small-town hopes that felt both precious and fragile. When it came time to leave, the sun beginning to rise, Elvis asked if he could help her family. "You already have, honey," Betty said. "You trusted me with your heart tonight." But Elvis had already decided. He wrote a check for $10,000 and left it under the coffee pot with a note. "For David Jr.'s college, for Sarah's dreams, for Michael's future, and for you, because everyone deserves to have their cup filled. With love and gratitude, Elvis." He also left a phone number on a napkin. "That's my private line at Graceland. If you ever need anything, you call. You're family now." Betty found the check after Elvis left and cried, not just because of the money, but because someone she'd cared for had cared for her in return. Elvis never forgot Betty Morrison or the lesson she taught him about unconditional love. He stopped at Martha's Diner every time he drove through Arkansas, and Betty became like a surrogate mother, someone who could tell him hard truths about taking care of himself. Betty's children all went to college with Elvis's help, but more importantly, they learned their mother's philosophy of endless love. David Jr. became an engineer, Sarah a teacher, Michael a social worker helping lost souls find their way back to themselves. When Elvis died in 1977, Betty was at Graceland among the mourners. A reporter asked what Elvis had been like as a person. "He was a good son who missed his mama," Betty said simply. "He was a man who carried other people's happiness until it almost broke him. And sometimes he was just someone who needed a hug." Betty Morrison passed away in 1995, but her legacy lives on in the thousands of people she served with maternal love. She understood something the world often forgets. Everyone, no matter how famous, sometimes just needs someone to hold them while they fall apart and then help them stand back up. Have you ever had someone who treated you like family when you needed it most? Tell us about them in the comments. Let's celebrate the Betty Morrisons in all our lives. If this story reminded you of the power of simple human kindness, make sure you're subscribed for more incredible true stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these stories of love, courage, and ordinary people who do extraordinary things. The most powerful thing Betty ever said to Elvis wasn't those 6 words that made him cry. It was what she whispered while she held him. "You don't have to be Elvis Presley for me, honey. You can just be you." And for the first time in years, that was enough.